working with, and if folks have questions, I can just start with that at the top as like a thing to make sure I cover in all of my rambling. So if anybody has something they want to drop in the chat, or if you have an area of interest that you want me to cover, I'm happy to jot down any notes so that I'm making sure I can do so. And also insert yourself at any point. I'm not easily offended. Otherwise, I can kind of hop in. All right, participants in the class, how people react. Yeah, that's great. Wonderful. Well, I'll just start by introducing myself. So my name is Lauren. I live in the Twin Cities in Minneapolis, Minnesota, and I am an artist and art therapist. So my background is in working with folks on a creative level and in a lot of disciplines to be able to learn more about themselves through art. I do that through both the Upcycled Closet, an Upcycled Closet that I run a lot of classes out of within the Mending framework, but then also do a lot of work within the art therapy end of things through Curiosity Studio, where we're encouraging folks to get started. And ultimately, the thesis of my work is sort of the same in both of those areas. I hope to encourage people to be creative as a way to learn about themselves and learn about others and gather in community. And that results from my own experiences of that being a healing space time and time again. And how do we like gather in a way that feels genuine and acknowledging and safe for everyone that comes. And so those are kind of the things that come up regardless of what I'm teaching, whether I'm teaching in Curiosity Studio or whether I'm teaching in an Upcycled Closet. And so a lot of my research over the years has been, how can we get the folks around us to be attracted to mending and repair and secondhand and all these topics that ultimately are sort of negating the need for more consumption. I think on the outset, I was trying to figure out how to offer a product that was repaired and recycled, and was finding myself just kind of inching a little bit more towards that capitalistic, like, I need to have a product, I need to turn things around, and all of that felt slimy. And despite having some ethical conversations within that of how am I sourcing secondhand, all these things, I ultimately deviated most of my programming to education, because that just felt the most in line with sort of the ethics and that anti-capitalist framework at which I'm working. But I have a big sort of why do we do this that I can share, and that ultimately comes down to a lot of information that I'm sure you all are familiar with as well. And I don't actually know if I can share my screen. I think I can. So I really do well with a little bit of a presentation. So if you can't see it, I do apologize, and I can send this to, I believe is it Ruth that is having trouble with the visuals? So I can send this to you as well at the end, but.
I can see it, Lauren. So
Lauren, okay. Oh, great, okay, cool. So I just kind of like this, I guess in my framework of mending, it's one of those great things that I can encourage folks from the get-go. Like, this is one of those rare instances where, I work with a lot of folks that are very concerned about perfectionism and very concerned about how do we work within a system, like how do we understand a skill and feel confident enough to continue to maintain that skill. And I think that this is a really exciting hobby or craft or art, whatever you want to call it, that there is no wrong way to engage with it. This is already a compromised thing that is in need of your work and your help. And so that's really exciting to me to kind of use that as a base level of introduction for my participants. In answer to your question, Devin, of like, how do we engage people? I think so often folks come to the class setting and they're feeling very vulnerable and feeling very cautious about a new thing, and learning a new thing can feel really intimidating. So I really do like to start with this point of like, there's actually no wrong way to mend. Like, what's going to happen? There's going to be a hole in it. Like there's not really a way that this is going to end problematically. And that really gives people a lot of ease. So that's exciting. Another thing that I tend to start all of my courses with is the why. I ask myself that a lot with the art that I make, with the things that I choose to engage with the social interactions that I do. Like, what is the purpose of my interaction here, and how can I be intentional in it? And so the why is the big question within the mending. And so ultimately, it kind of comes back to this conversation of consumption. So we are buying more and more things, and we're using them less. And then we're just continuing to make more and more. And so this problem obviously didn't happen overnight. And it is very much linked to the rise in fast fashion, the rise in this capitalism, society that requires us to have XYZ be produced to be able to replace XYZ that wasn't yet ready to be produced. So there's this bit of contradiction there that certainly makes it really hard to be a consumer in this environment. But I do like to always acknowledge as well within all of the classes that I teach and with all the environments that I work is this isn't also new. Mending previously was a necessity and something that we've found in a variety of our cultural settings and a variety of our regions around the world. And so I always like to acknowledge that this practice of collecting scraps from everyday fabric and using them to make quilts was largely a huge way that we see this across cultures. But also it's been a task that's largely been assigned to women and often a necessity of poverty. And so I like to point out these pieces too, because I think it is important to know where we kind of get the inspiration of what we come from. And I think that context is really is a necessity to this hobby. So here's a couple examples of regional ways that we've seen this type of mending, especially that visible mending that has kind of risen in its popularity over the last few years. And this is rooted in a lot of different regions of the world. We see it rooted in the South in the United States. We see it rooted in places across the Bangladesh region and India. We see these rooted across areas of Japan. All of these come from a place. And so I like to take a lot of time within my classes to describe that history as well. So ultimately we get to this question of, okay, so if this has been the case for a long time, it was a necessity, it wasn't a choice. How did we get to the point where it's a choice to mend our clothes? And so I think that really is linked to the rise in fast fashion and industrialization. So in 1846, we see the invention of the sewing machine happen. 1856, we see synthetic dyes become invented. And then in the late 19th, early 20th centuries, we see all of these synthetic materials like rayon, acetate, nylon, and all of these these competitors to our natural fibers. And so that we see that play out today in regions like India, where the farmers are protesting for different rights within the labor that they're doing, and also just for a different base pay within the industry itself. The cotton industry there is trying to compete with the industry of these synthetic fibers. And so that's an impossible situation when you have this rate of, this value is very, it's hard to compete with when there's all these players involved. And that obviously also is within this capitalist system. So I also go into a bit of statistics in all of my classes that I teach. And that obviously is something that I don't like to share always, because it can make it, I think stats can be used in a very unfair way, oftentimes within minorities especially. And so I like to bring this up, but also point out this particular statistic as a way to address that we have a choice in whether or not we mend. And that choice, this is a very empowering statistic for me, because it's a choice that ultimately leads to saving a lot of resources and energy. And so I think that seeing this, about every pair of jeans uses about 10 years of drinking water. I don't even have a way to calculate what 10 years of drinking water looks like. That's a project I'm actually really wanting to do and trying to figure out how to do. But that is something that I think is really interesting, because we can grasp the idea that mending something instead of replacing it saves 10 years of drinking water. So regardless of the statistic and how it's kind of proving or what it's trying to say, it does allow for my individual choice to be validated and say, all right, there's more, it's an important stat, all right, let me check this chat just to make sure I'm on the right page. So do I discuss with folks what kinds of projects make the best mending results? Is it worth the time and frustration to try mending a Forever 21 thing that will fall apart later anyhow, given that people have limited time and energy to commit to these projects? I love this question. And this is definitely some context that I like to like to share is, how do we have a conversation, or how do we consume, and what are the ways that we consume? I think that this is something that I especially consider, because I've done a lot of tailoring and I've done a lot of mending for folks in like a hemming way and making clothes fit their bodies. And I think that conversations around this tend to go to the slowing down portion of my classes, where when we are actually slowing down and mending our clothes, we see very quickly how poor quality that is really important to this conversation of, these are ways that we are, sorry, I lost my train of thought for a second because I was trying to make sure the cat wasn't involved. But how do we have conversations around, this is the quality that I'm noticing over and over again happening, and this quality is really poor. So how am I going to change where I'm buying the next time? And so, yes, a Forever 21 item might not be worth your time. And so then the question is, what can I do differently next time? Can I afford a higher quality item? Is there a different thing that I'm able to find, et cetera, et cetera? I also am not going to sit here and say that everyone has access to the most sustainable item. And so I don't like to sit on that like socioeconomic, like high horse of sustainability and say that like this is accessible to everybody. And so I think that that's a really important piece as well. I hope that answers that question a bit, but I do try to draw attention to that when folks are saying, like when we talk about the mending practice, I think anytime we engage in a practice of something and practicing how we're fixing clothes, there's a conversation around, what do you learn over the time of a practice? And so as you're practicing, you're going to like pay attention and you're going to say, oh, wow, this is really poor quality, or wow, this is something that I need to pay more attention to. So that's certainly an aspect of that. Yeah. And also how much you love it. Exactly. It is something that's really helpful. And then this next question, conversations that's been coming up in the sewing world this last week, the difference between using visible mending techniques like sashiko and fetishizing them. This has been really important to me. And I really encourage folks to look at that post that Ruth is mentioning. There's been a rise in the conversations around, and I've had a lot of dialogue with some fiber artists this week of what is the line at which we're appropriating culture, and what's the line at which we're inspired by? And so often that's a conversation that the line is quite thin. And one of the things that I do within my practice is I'm not engaging in sashiko mending. I think there's this term of how do we talk about and what do we label the item that we're mending and the practice that we're engaging with. So let me show you an example here. So in the top right corner and then the bottom left corner, these are two examples of Japanese Boro method. And the Japanese Boro method was a result of the lower class within Japan within the late 19th and early 20th centuries being restricted to the fiber and the textile that they had access to. And so in that lack of access, they were responsible for committing and making their own garments from start to finish. So at the beginning of this practice, they were, if they lived which often was in Japan, a dry region where you were going to be able to make linen, you were then taking and making your own flax, you were grinding it, you were making linen, you were then dyeing it, typically using Japanese indigo method, and then you would apply to it on top once that had, whether it was worn or faded, there was a conversation around if it was able to continue to go. And there's a lot of language around this is too good to waste, and a lot of phrases within Japanese culture that talk about how do we keep something in its longevity because there's a restriction to the access of that material in the first place. And so I am under the belief that context is everything when we talk about aesthetic. Context is incredibly important to this conversation of visible mending, because Was it inspired by the Japanese Boro method and sashiko thread and that type of stitch pattern? And you could argue that, of course it was, that absolutely is the case. And then I show a couple different examples here of other regions around the world where that same practice is used. And we call it something different within different regions. So on the top left, we have a kantha quilt, which is in the area of Bangladesh and India. And the kantha quilt that we specifically, there's two kinds of kantha quilts. There's the Doroka kantha quilt, and then there's the Nakshi kantha quilt, and that's a double-sided quilt. So again, like I said, there's areas around the world where there's all kinds of practice of taking samples and scraps of traditional wear within that culture and using that to create a longevity to the product, because we all had limited access prior to globalization of materials that we were able to access within our mending practice. And then in the middle bottom, we have an example of pajai, which is the example of the textile quilting practice that's in Korea. So on the bottom right and then the top middle, we have two examples of Gee's Bend quilts, and that was a result of enslavement in the South that resulted in the restriction of fabric. And so then we have an example of all of these beautiful quilts that were made out of a lot of creativity and a lot of restriction. And so I like to share all of these because that to me is the context of how we get to today and how we get to the conversation of who do we stand, like who do we stand among with our practices. I think that there's a really important distinction too between what are we calling things and why are we calling it that, And so I'm really open to that dialogue, and I would love to even talk about it today, because I think that there is this fetishization that happens within hobbies especially. And I think that can be really damaging. And as the conversation is being said that Ruth mentioned, I think is a really helpful way to be critical of how we're talking about things and ways that we're centering the conversation. So over the course of time, I've broadened my course to be about mending, because I think that, there are so many trended conversations around visible mending and where did that originate? And so my course has always been about how do we mend and how do we fix what we have? And with these goals of, environmentalism as at the core. And so I hope that helps answer that question, Ruth, or kind of brings some of that to within the dialogue of, how to be thoughtful and how to be questioning of where we're profiting and how we're making sense of the sources of our conversations. So, and please continue to have that conversation in the chat as well. Okay, so it looks like I'm just keeping up with the chat because I just want to keep it relevant to what you all are talking about. So within Forever 21 and H&M, there are pieces that are just made better and that have lasted years. I think it's really important to, one of the slides that I have that I'll kind of jump to is, okay, so there's this piece that I can come back to a lot is I think Ashley, you talked about this too. Oh, sorry, no, I'm having the wrong, but in that conversation, oh, that's very nice, Jordan. But there is a conversation about, how much clothing we buy and we never use. And so there's a huge conversation of like, oh, okay, so H&M now has this buyback program. And a lot of people ask me, where should I buy sustainably? Where should I use things? Where should I have like any consumption that I'm doing? And where should that happen? And I think that is a really fair question. And I always like to kind of answer that question with another question of, what is our consumption and why do we need to buy another thing? And so I think that the caveat within these conversations is that we need more. And in all actuality, it's not that we need more. And so these buyback programs, I ask people to think very critically of, because I really recommend checking out the Slow Factory for a lot of their programming, because they talk quite a bit about the colonialism that happens within the fashion industry and the ways that it's alive and well today. And within those conversations, they're talking quite a bit about the waste that is generated within the donation centers, and then where the donation centers are delivering that waste and the impact that has, because the global north is very unaware and very often unaware. We know that there's a lot of people that are very aware of this problem, but the global north really can perpetuate these problems to the global south. And that's that out of sight, out of mind that happens within the waste in the textile industry. So I do kind of bring that to my next point of be aware of greenwashing within these brands that are quote unquote sustainable. And I do have a course that I recommend through them that they do, which is on sustainability literacy. And it talks a lot about the sustainability within, or the language that we use within the conversations of sustainability, and how sustainability isn't necessarily always linked to good things, because we talk about it with such a especially whitewashed perspective. But how do we do this in a way that is still these terms that these buzz terms that we enjoy, which is, the responsible thinkers, the sustainability, ethical, we want all those things. But how do we scratch the surface of those terms a little bit more to avoid this greenwashing that can often come up within the sustainability conversation? So that's kind of my little plug there in terms of, these conversations around Forever 21 and H&M always do come up in these conversations. And I really love to hit that, because the most sustainable clothing is sustainable, or the most sustainable item is the item in your closet that continues to ring true over and over and over again. And so I really recommend that, keeping the thing that, makes sense to you, and keeping the thing that you already have that's beautiful. And that's the best practice you can do. And then if it does allow you to continue to use it over and over, that's the best case scenario. So that's my little spiel there. But I want to go back to, an unmending project a few years ago where I unstitched and removed sequins from clothing I couldn't wear anymore. I think that's so great. So I'll go back. I'm going to bump back up now. Sorry to buzz around, but I like to make this relevant to what folks need. So one of the things that is central to my practice of mending is the idea of repair as care. So I think that repairing clothes and repairing things around us certainly has the care that we extend to the item itself. But I think that goes beyond the item itself. It really goes within our communities. It goes to the piece that I just mentioned of, if we have donated items that we're giving up that aren't really in good shape, and then what happens to that donated item if we actually repair it and we care for it? How do we care for the community around us by not just perpetuating waste, et cetera, et cetera? So repair as care is the central theme. And it also goes back to what Ruth is talking about. If we're repairing within the context of appropriating a culture, that isn't repair and caring for that's not caring for our environment. That's not caring for those around us. So how do we repair in the most ethical and conscious way that we can? And sometimes that feels like, oh my gosh, Lauren, I just want to fix the elbow in my shirt. That's also true. We can just fix the elbow in our shirt. But I think if we, as always, and I think that the intent of this group is very much rooted in this, is to be critical of the things around us and to think consciously about the things around us. I think it's a really important thing for us to think about. How do we extend further care into this conversation? A book that I really love is called Folk Fashion by Amy Tiller. Oh God, what's her last name? I have it in my notes at the end, but she talks about the unwinding and the unmending of where are we getting our source materials? And so she undoes a lot of knit projects, and she she rips out fiber from, let's say, a Forever 21 item, or she rips out fiber from a item that she finds in the thrift store. And what she has found is this project that really oh yeah, I'm glad to hear that. It's so fabulous because it really talks about what is the root of our making too. And I think that when we make something and when we think about the most ethical way to make something, I just think it really is worth having a conversation of where are we sourcing that material? How are we caring for the thing from the start? I just really enjoyed that book. So that's a little bit of a tangent. Another quote that I like to share, and then I'm gonna make sure that I give some time for questions. But I like to share this quote by Emma Shercliffe. It is not lost on me that this is shared over a screen, but I always share it in my classes because this is the central theme to the therapeutic aspects of the work that I do. So if screen-based work can provoke fractured and dislocated sense of self. By contrast, handwork can encourage a focused awareness of the body as a whole being, literally in touch with its environment. So I really like to bring that up because I think it's central to the idea that when we are in touch with the items that we use, when we are in like relationship with the items that we have in front of us, I think it can feel like a little silly sometimes to be like, what's the relationship you have? But if you're constantly like taking an inventory, finding mends before they get too big, you know, all these things, this ultimately is going to lead to a healthier relationship, same as any human relationship that we have, right? So if we are in contact and in conversation with the clothes that we have, in like, you know, it doesn't have to be this huge spiritual thing that I'm making it sound like it is, but it, you know, how do we check in on the things around us that allow us to be ahead of ourselves, you know, and repairing things before it gets too late. So I think that that's really great. Yeah, I think it's really, it's a sensory thing. And within the art therapy world, we have a thing that is called the Theory of Materiality. And it talks about how do we access different materials, and the ways that we access those materials strengthen our wellness and our mental health. So within the fiber world, we have a lot of smells. We have we have the five senses, and so we actually hit most of those senses when we're into the fiber world. We have a scent that can come with different fibers. We have a taste that can come with different fibers. People have told me that they know the type of fiber because they can sometimes taste it. You can also do like a small flame test with like a match, that sometimes if you find things secondhand, you can do like a test your fiber content that way. But my point being is that we have so many access points to this fiber and to this item that there's, you know, all these senses are being hit. So it actually does wake up and have a huge part of us engaged in this conversation, which is really, really positive. So I like to bring that into the conversation as well. Most of these, I like to share this image because I like to just also articulate the importance of this within community. And I think that's one of the main reasons I like to be here today and I like to do classes, is that when we gather in community over this, this is so often how a lot of these techniques have been perfected. And I think that's one of the central themes to this group as well, is these techniques are from shared resourcing and shared material. And how do we share the skills that we have to better the environment and better the world around us and the communities around us. So I really love teaching these in a community space because it's really important and central to the work in general. Let's see here. Yeah, so I would recommend within that recycling bins, there's one of the Slow Factory talks that's really good is within the conversation of the Or is Present is an organization that works with within Ghana and advocates for the workers within different markets of Ghana that are selling products that are brought to Ghana as an export of largely the global north. So usually the United States, usually places in Europe and Canada. And that export is often brought, and the quality of those exports are going down considerably. And so their work is super huge, and it's really environmentally like sound, and it's really informed on all these levels that I really recommend. So the Or is Present is their information, and they're worth checking out. All right, so let's see where we're at. So one of the things that I like to talk about with folks is what is first within our mending. How do we figure out like the fiber content of the material that we've got? How do we figure out all of these pieces that, you know, I want to make sure that folks understand what it is that they're wanting to mend. So we have two different kinds of mends that we're working with. We have two different kinds of fabric groups, so we have woven materials and then we have knit materials. So our woven materials are going to be more of our, like our bed sheets are woven materials, our jeans are woven materials, all of these things. Are super central to our wardrobes. But then if you're like me and you are more of a creature of comfort, you're probably more familiar with those knit materials and all of the ones that we see, these tiny little V's that make up a stretchier garment, and they are stretchier fabric. So that's our t-shirts. That's all of our stuff that makes our lives a little comfier. And so we've got different techniques and different tools that we need for those different jobs. So there's sort of that right tool for the right job conversation, certainly. And I do like to talk about access to materials within this conversation as well, because so often, especially I think within sustainable, quote unquote, like sustainable conversations, we're saying, what do we need to go out and buy in order to do this? And I really like to rebuke that and say, there's a lot of things we have around us that will allow us to do these skills. So within the repair world, there's darning, and darning often has conversations of use a darning egg. And it's that bottom left, there's a little illustration there for you of a darning egg. And it's just it's a wooden tool, and you can find them oftentimes at antique stores or vintage markets, because it's just, again, another casualty of fast fashion where we don't have that same need and that same egg, like availability. So you see them at places like antique shops. But my point is, you don't need a darning egg. It often looks very similar to a light bulb or a wooden block from your kids' toys, or another tool that you find. Sometimes I use a piece of fruit and citrus, and then I'll like nick it with my needle, and then I smell the zest of the orange peel, on my sock or whatever. So you have plenty of other tools around you. And within the like sourcing of tools for materials, there's a lot of really great spots that you can find secondhand materials, because it's really important to know that there are a lot of materials available. And we do live in this age of technology where we can have all kinds of things available via eBay or via, all these other websites that aren't just the Amazons of the world. But it is really hard to, that like barrier to entry of access to materials. I don't ever want to discourage folks to be able to get into something that ultimately is a skill that we all really love or can love. So this goes back to that conversation also that Ruth introduced of, what is that, that conversation between visible mending, that link that often happens and has been appropriated most of the time, or oftentimes, or can be within the sashiko thread and the Japanese Boro method. And so context is everything, but I do like to also say that mending can be as visible or invisible as we want to make it. And so we have this example of how it's, grown in popularity based on this, this conversation, and, how do people intersect with mending, but it doesn't have to be a super visible practice as well. So that's been something that, we have a long history of. So we think of like garments that used to be made, back when quality of garments was very high. And so we see the garments be made with a very large seam allowance. And so we had about like 1 to 2 inches, because we anticipated that bodies were going to change over time. So bodies were going to ebb and flow within our years of living. We allowed this 2 to 3 inch or 1 to 2 inch seam allowance to be able to bring in our garment, to take out our garment as our body changed over time. That also was a way that we could fix our garment. So we would take material and like thread from that seam allowance to make the most invisible mend with the actual garment material that it initially was made with. And so that's really interesting too, I think, to just see the ways that we almost set ourselves up for success. So now when I make my own garments, I actually stash away a lot of like little scraps, of material, so that I can make sure that it's something that I really make sure I, use again when I need to fix that garment. And that's me planning for super future Lauren, but it's also me trying to make sure that I am set up for the like most invisible mend if I choose to have that be the case when I fix it later. I also operate and live by the 3-foot rule, which gives a lot of ease. So if there's something that I'm learning, I can get really frustrated and really want to make sure that I am making it look so good or have it look really nice. And then I like stand back 3 feet and I'm like, dang, that looks pretty good. So, oh gosh, in meters, I'm not sure what meters it would be. I guess the point, I'm 1 meter, thank you. So you could have the 1 meter rule. So I have a tendency to be really hard on myself when I look really closely at something. So whether it's 3 feet or a meter, it just says, it's a philosophy that I adopt in my kindness to myself and kindness to others of just stand back and see what it looks like from far away. Chances are you're not going to notice. So that tends to be a tool that I use within my teaching as well. So here's a couple of examples of more of that visible mending, and this is specifically on woven garments. And so this is the example of, we have a lot of considerations that we want to make when we're fixing jeans. I make really big patches on my jeans because I like to be able to move in them and have them be something that I can kneel up and down, and then not have that hem that is the edge of my patch bump into my knee all day. So then I'm annoyed, because the goal, I always encourage this within my classes, is the goal of our garment fixing and repairing isn't so it's uncomfortable. It's so it's comfortable so we wear it longer, right? The goal isn't to have us just fix it and then be done with it. The goal is to fix it and use it. And so if it's something that we're not fixing, that's going to be really hard. And then darning is our knit method. That's how we're fixing the knits in our lives. And so there's a couple different stitches that I like to teach folks, but ultimately we're trying to capture and fix that live pesky stitch. If you're a knitter, I see there's some crocheting. There's a different makeup to the garment itself that we're making, or the thing that we're making, because it's a series of stitches. Whereas when it's a woven textile, they're all woven together. And so that live stitch is what we want to contain when we're in the darning practice. So here's an example of what's called a Scotch darn method. And this is the difference you can see, is that we're building within a material versus when we have a patch, we're putting it on the end and on top. So that's just a difference there of the darning method. And here it is on some socks. So that really can give some longevity to our items as well. And it looks like, yes, there is some bad experiences when we have the wrong materials. So that like darning, it looks like Ruth had experience of like a regular sewing machine thread. And so the more we learn about materials and the ways that those tools can interact with our, right tool for the right job kind of thing, it can really give us some freedom. And Devin, it looks like there were some experiences there as well. And then of course we have like our zippers and our other items that need repaired. A very quick fix that hopefully will give you all some ease is grease from a pencil. The lead of a pencil is a great thing to grease up your zippers on your coats. Iron-on patches are a great thing to just keep around. So if you need to like iron on anything when you're in like a hotel or somewhere where you just need a really quick fix, that can be just like a really easy quick fix for you. So there's all these tools that we can use and keep in our mending kits. And I like to have a traveling mending kit for that very reason, because it's always nice to be prepared. And there has been times where I've been like in a public space, sitting in the bathroom with my pants off, trying to mend the pants so I can go back to my daily life. So there's nothing is too weird. All right, so I want to get to the questions because I think that there's, I'm aware of our time and I just want to make sure, because I can throw information at folks all day. And I just want to encourage you that like the goal of any of the work that I do is to encourage confidence in the maker and encourage confidence for the sake of continuing and having sustained action within the habit that you are doing. And so how do I encourage folks to have the most sustained action? It's not to like beat it over your head and say like, this is the way, this is the, I'm not trying to like argue with folks. I just want to introduce that like art and creativity can exist within our wardrobe as well, and within our mending practices. And it can be a really empowering way for us to display that to the world, and a subversive way to say, hey, I'm actually asking more of the things around me, and some of the things that the ways that we consume, and that commodity activism is really central to my work as well. So I'm just yammered. Does anybody have any questions or thoughts as we conclude?
That was absolutely wonderful, Lauren. Thank you. Was that just someone with a question? Jeff is saying that they learned a lot.
Oh, I'm so glad. It's really interesting. I think it's a really great, I think it's always worth scratching the surface of these conversations, because it's, we can talk about how mending was something that I just always come back to that clothing used to be in our wills. You know, clothing used to have it to the extent that it was worth passing down to our children and so forth. And so I think it's really important to just acknowledge, like, how do we value our clothing now? All right.
I think that Regina had a question, and we've also got a couple others.
Yep.
Regina.
Yeah, hey. Yeah. I was trying to type, but I have a broken finger, so it's hard to type that fast. My question was just like, when you were talking about the Japanese techniques, from your perspective, what is the line between inspiration and misappropriation of techniques? And so are we only limited to like American traditions because we're American, or I just wanted your like hot take on that. And then just how you approach it as far as being knowledgeable about the techniques.
Yeah, I think that's a great question. And it's a question I often ask of my colleagues and my peers around me because I'm of course limited in the fact that I'm a white woman, and I am often and I have been historically the oppressor. And so I don't want to ever act as if I almost just can't be the one to have the hot take here, because it isn't a tradition that stemmed from within my own traditions. However, I did have these traditions of mending and skills sharing that happened within the generations of my family. And so I think that I always bring culture into the conversation, because if I didn't, I feel that would be misinformation of what it is that this practice has served all across the world. And I like to say that in this culture, it means this. In this culture, it's called this. In this culture, it's called this. And I think it's really important to cite that source and cite it as an inspiration to this skill set in its current form. I think currently, like, I've been mending clothes longer than the visible mending trend has been around. However, I can't disassociate that from me saying mending is happening, you know? And so I think it's really essential to bring that as a source within that. And I'm also really open to any feedback if that feels like it's ever being an appropriative act, right? So I think that I don't call what I do Japanese Boro, because it's not Japanese Boro. It's not using sashiko thread. I don't buy sashiko thread. That doesn't feel appropriate to me based on what I do. And so I don't call it what it's not, I guess is my point. So I'm not doing that technique. However, I recognize that it is very much influenced by that technique in its current day. And that feels important to name and to always be knowledgeable of. So I do a lot of research and I read a lot, and I'm constantly citing those sources and want to always be open to dialogue if that feels like it's not appropriate. Does that make sense?
Yeah, for sure. I just I come from like a music background, and like I just see things as like an advantage to be able to see like different or hear different sounds from different areas. So I was just kind of trying to apply that to this situation.
Yeah.
But yeah, like that absolutely makes sense that you're not naming it. And yeah, thanks for your response. I appreciate it.
I think a lot of folks are going through that right now. So I think it's really cool that you're having that dialogue. Yeah.
Thank you, Lauren, and thank you, Regina, for the very interesting question. It is very sadly now 12 o'clock, and the end of our meeting. This was excellent and wonderful. I'm going to go ahead and say, if you have any more questions, please address them to the list. I would love for this conversation to keep going. And thank you very much, Lauren, for your time and your knowledge.
Thank you. I appreciate it so much. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, everyone. Bye-bye.